The blizzard of 1878 didn't just freeze the Colorado Territory. It buried secrets, snuffed out lives, and forged legends that would be whispered in saloons for a century. They called it the White Death. On the worst night of that historic storm, a man walked into the Oak Haven Town Jail looking less like a human and more like a mountain god carved from ice and fury. He hadn't come for warmth, and he hadn't come for whiskey. He came with saddlebags heavy with raw gold, a loaded Winchester, and a vow to buy the freedom of a woman freezing in a cell, even if he had to marry her at the stroke of dawn to keep the law off her back forever. Caleb Wyatt was not a man built for the comforts of polite society. Standing 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block a cabin door and a beard thick with the wild tangle of the Bitterroot Wilderness, he was a creature of the high timber. He lived 20 miles out of Oak Haven, up where the air was thin and the winters were merciless. For 5 years, Caleb had trapped, hunted, and panned the icy streams, hoarding away a fortune in dust and nuggets that he buried beneath the hearthstones of his isolated cabin. He had no use for town life, not until a half-frozen, delirious fur trapper stumbled onto his porch with news that made Caleb's blood run colder than the wind outside. It was Clara Higgins. 2 winters ago, Caleb had taken a grisly claw to the thigh and dragged himself down the mountain, half dead from blood loss and infection. It was Clara, the daughter of a hard-luck prospector, who had found him on the edge of her property. She had dragged his massive frame into her shed, boiled the willow bark, stitched his torn flesh, and nursed him through a fever that should have killed him. She asked for nothing in return. She possessed a quiet, unbreakable grace that haunted Caleb long after he returned to the high country. Now, the trapper gasped out the dark truth. Clara's father, Thomas, had died a month prior, leaving behind a fabricated, crushing mountain of debt to Josiah Blackwood, Oak Haven's wealthiest saloon owner and ruthless land baron. Blackwood had called in the marker. By law of the territory, Clara was held responsible. She had been thrown into the town's freezing stone jail by Sheriff Montgomery Bates, a man who lived comfortably in Blackwood's deep pockets. The ultimatum was clear. Clara was to be shipped off to the Territorial Labor Prison at dawn on the prison wagon, a virtual death sentence for a frail woman, unless she agreed to sign over her father's land and become Blackwood's contracted companion to work off the debt. It was extortion, raw and ugly. Caleb didn't hesitate. He pulled up the hearthstones, hauling out 2 heavy leather pouches of unrefined gold. He strapped on his twin Colt revolvers, slung his Winchester repeater over his shoulder, and pulled on his heavy buffalo hide coat. Outside, the storm was already reaching a deafening crescendo. The wind shrieked through the pines like a choir of the damned, driving needles of ice sideways. The snow was already waist-deep and rising fast. Taking his massive Belgian draft cross, a beast of a horse named Samson, Caleb began the descent. The 20-mile ride to Oak Haven was a journey through a white hell. Within the first hour, the trail vanished, buried beneath shifting dunes of powder. Caleb had to navigate by the sheer memory of the ridge lines and the sway of the evergreens. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against his chest, freezing the moisture in his breath to his beard. He could feel the frost biting at the edges of his face, the numbing lethargy creeping into his extremities. By midnight, Samson was floundering. The snow had reached the horse's chest, and the animal was exhausting itself with every plunging step. Caleb dismounted, the snow swallowing him to his thighs. "Easy, boy, easy," Caleb grunted, his voice swallowed instantly by the howling gale. He grabbed the heavy leather reins and began to walk, forging the path with his own body to spare his horse. For hours, the mountain man pushed through the drifts, his muscles burning with lactic acid, his lungs searing with the frozen air. It was a test of pure, unadulterated will. Any lesser man would have curled up beneath a pine tree and let the snow claim him. But Caleb's mind was anchored to a single, burning image: Clara, locked in an iron cage, shivering in the dark. He thought of her gentle hands, the soft cadence of her voice, when she read by the lantern light while he healed. She was a woman of the earth, kind and strong, but she was entirely alone against the predatory cruelty of men like Blackwood. As the hours bled away, Caleb's vision tunneled. Hallucinations flickered at the edges of his sight, shadows dancing in the snow, the phantom sounds of voices. He pushed the madness away, focusing on the mechanical rhythm of his legs. Step, drag, push, over and over. He lost the feeling in his boots. He lost the feeling in his fingers. But the heavy weight of the gold in his saddlebags served as an anchor to his purpose. Sometime in the pitch-black hours of the early morning, the dense timber finally broke. Below him, barely visible through the swirling whiteout, the faint, flickering yellow lights of Oakhaven struggled against the storm. The town was entirely shut down, entombed by the blizzard. Nobody in their right mind was awake, and certainly, nobody was traveling. Caleb pulled himself back onto Samson's saddle. He was covered from head to toe in a thick crust of ice, a frozen titan descending upon a town that believed itself safe behind its locked doors. He checked his sidearm, breaking the ice that had frozen over the hammer. He was a man who preferred the peace of the woods, but tonight he was bringing the storm with him. Inside the Oakhaven jail, the cold was absolute. The building was constructed of thick, uninsulated river stone that seemed to absorb the freezing temperature from outside and radiated inward. In the single, iron-barred holding cell at the back of the room, Clara Higgins sat huddled on a wooden cot, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She was wrapped in a thin, moth-eaten wool blanket that did nothing to stop the violent tremors shaking her body. Her breath plumed in the dim light of the single kerosene lantern hanging near the sheriff's desk. Clara's face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, but her dark eyes burned with a defiant, quiet rage. Across the room, sitting close to a cast-iron potbelly stove that radiated a meager warmth, sat Sheriff Montgomery Bates and Josiah Blackwood. Blackwood was a man of expensive tastes and cheap morals. He wore a tailored wool suit and a silk cravat, idly smoking a cheroot while he sipped from a flask of imported brandy. Sheriff Bates, a heavy-set man with a weak chin and cruel eyes, was nursing a tin cup of coffee, occasionally glancing back at the cell with a sneer. "It's going to be a long, miserable ride on that prison wagon tomorrow, Clara," Blackwood said, his voice smooth, dripping with false sympathy. "Assuming the wagon can even break through the drifts. The guards aren't known for their gentle disposition, especially in weather like this. You'll be chipping rocks in the territorial pen for the next 10 years. A delicate thing like you won't last 2 winters." Clara didn't answer. She tightened her grip on the blanket, staring blankly at the rusted iron bars. $3,000, Sheriff Bates chimed in, leaning back in his chair. "Your old man left a hell of a mess, girl. The law is the law. The bank called the debt, and Josiah here holds the paper. You default, you pay with labor. It's the territory way." It was a lie, and Clara knew it. Thomas Higgins had borrowed $500 to buy mining equipment, putting the deed to their small, mineral-rich property up as collateral. When Thomas fell ill, Blackwood had doctored the ledgers, adding exorbitant interest rates and fabricated supply costs until the debt ballooned to an impossible $3,000. It was a calculated land grab. Blackwood knew Thomas was dying, and he knew Clara had no family, no legal counsel, and no money to fight back. But Blackwood didn't just want the land. He wanted Clara broken. He wanted her pride. Blackwood stood up, walking slowly to the edge of the cell. He blew a stream of gray smoke through the bars. "It doesn't have to be this way, Clara. You know my offer still stands. Sign the deed over to me tonight. Sign the companionship contract. I'll clear the debt, put you up in a warm room above the saloon, buy you silk dresses. You'll serve drinks, smile for the high rollers, and be my personal guest. It's a far better life than freezing in a stone quarry." Clara raised her head, her gaze meeting Blackwood's. Her voice was hoarse from the cold, but steady. "I would rather freeze to
This
death
story
in
was
this cell,
posted on the channel The
Josiah,
Rusty
than
Saddle.
spend a
Please
single
do not
night under your
repost it
roof."
in any form.
Blackwood's face darkened, the veneer of the gentleman slipping to reveal the predator beneath. Pride is a foolish thing for a woman with no options. By dawn, the magistrate will be here to sign the transfer papers. If the debt isn't paid in full in cash or gold, you belong to the state. And the state will gladly lease your labor back to me. He turned back to the stove, pouring himself another measure of brandy. "Let her freeze, Monty. The cold has a way of changing minds by daybreak." The hours dragged on. The storm outside battered the thick wooden shutters, the wind screaming as if trying to tear the roof from the building. The fire in the stove began to die down, and Bates was too lazy to fetch more wood from the shed out back. The temperature in the room dropped further. Clara could feel the numbness spreading from her toes up through her legs. She closed her eyes, trying to retreat into her memories to escape the physical agony of the cold. She thought of the mountain, of the summer wildflowers, and of the quiet giant of a man she had healed 2 years ago. Caleb. She wondered if he was safe in his cabin, far above this wretched town. She had never reached out to him for help. It wasn't in her nature to beg, and she knew Caleb despised Oakhaven and the corruption within it. She had resigned herself to her fate. She would not sign Blackwood's contract. She would take the prison wagon, and she would fight to survive, or she would die trying. "Almost 5 in the morning, Sheriff Bates muttered, checking his pocket watch. He yawned, stretching his arms. "Magistrate Hopkins should be tramping through the snow soon as there's a lick of daylight. Ain't nobody coming with $3,000, Clara." Last chance. Clara remained silent, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the jailhouse shuddered. Bates frowned, looking up. Winds picking up. A second later, a tremendous crack echoed through the room. The iron bolt holding the door sheared clean off its mountings. The heavy wooden door blew violently inward, slamming against the stone wall with the force of a cannon shot. A howling gust of snow and wind ripped into the room, instantly blowing out the kerosene lantern and sending papers scattering in a chaotic blizzard across the office. Sheriff Bates jumped to his feet, fumbling for the revolver at his hip. Blackwood dropped his brandy flask, his eyes widening in shock. Standing in the doorway, framed by the swirling, violent whiteout of the storm, was a nightmare. Caleb Wyatt stepped over the threshold, pulling the shattered door shut behind him with a violent shove, plunging the room into the dim, shadowy light of the dying stove. He was a terrifying sight. A thick crust of white ice coated his buffalo coat, his beard, and his hat. He looked twice his normal size, a hulking, primal force of nature that had just breached the sanctum of civilized corruption. He didn't say a word as he stomped the heavy snow from his boots. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He unslung the Winchester repeater from his shoulder, not aiming it, but holding it with a casual, lethal readiness in his right hand. Over his left shoulder hung the heavy leather saddlebags. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" Sheriff Bates stammered, his hand hovering nervously over his holster. "You can't just break down the door of the county jail." Caleb ignored him, his piercing blue eyes, the only part of his face not obscured by ice and hair, swept the room until they found the iron cell in the back. He saw the small, huddled figure wrapped in the blanket. Clara. Caleb's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was the sound of grinding stones. Clara gasped, pulling the blanket down from her face. She blinked, unable to process what she was seeing. "Caleb? How? You shouldn't be here." "The storm. I heard you were in trouble," Caleb said simply, walking past the sheriff as if the man were a piece of furniture. He stopped at the bars, reaching a massive, leather-gloved hand through the iron to gently touch her shivering shoulder. The warmth of his hand, even through the leather, sent a shock through her. "You're freezing." "Hey!" Josiah Blackwood snapped, recovering his composure and stepping forward, trying to project authority. Step away from the prisoner, Mountain Man. This is a matter of law. She is a ward of the county until her debts are settled, and you are trespassing. Caleb slowly turned his head to look at Blackwood. The sheer intensity of Caleb's stare made the wealthy businessman take an involuntary step back. "I'm here to settle her debt," Caleb said. Sheriff Bates let out a nervous, barking laugh. "You? A dirt-scratching trapper? She owes $3,000, mister. That ain't something you pay with beaver pelts and deer meat." Caleb walked over to the sheriff's desk. With a heavy thud that rattled the inkwells, he dropped the frozen leather saddlebags onto the wood. He unbuckled the straps and reached inside, pulling out 4 heavy canvas sacks. He untied the top of the first sack and tipped it. A cascade of dull, heavy, yellow metal spilled onto the blotter. Raw gold nuggets, some the size of marbles, and ounces of pure, unrefined gold dust shimmered in the dim light of the stove fire. Blackwood's breath caught in his throat. His eyes locked onto the pile of gold, avarice instantly replacing his shock. $3,000, Caleb stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Weigh it. There's closer to 5,000 there. Take the 3 and give me the papers." Bates looked at Blackwood, completely out of his depth. Blackwood, however, was a snake whose venom hadn't yet run dry. He saw his carefully laid trap unraveling, the land and the woman slipping through his fingers. He quickly calculated his angles. The deadline was midnight. Blackwood lied smoothly, checking his pocket watch. "It is now past 5 in the morning. The debt has defaulted. The property and the labor contract are forfeit to me." Caleb's movement was so fast it was a blur. In a fraction of a second, the Winchester was leveled directly at the center of Blackwood's chest. The hammer cocked back with a sharp, deafening click that echoed in the silent room. Sheriff Bates froze, his hand halfway to his gun. "Now hold on. Let's not do anything crazy here." "The deadline," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet register, "is dawn. The magistrate isn't here yet. The sun isn't up. The debt is paid." Blackwood swallowed hard, staring down the dark, hollow barrel of the rifle. He could see Caleb's finger resting lightly on the trigger. There was no hesitation in the mountain man's eyes, no fear of the law. Blackwood realized, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that this man would kill them both without a second thought, leave the gold, and walk out into the storm with Clara. "Fine," Blackwood choked out, raising his hand slowly. "Fine. The debt is paid. Bates, get the ledger. Write the receipt." "Sheriff." Caleb didn't move his eyes from Blackwood. "Unlock the cell. Bring her to the stove." Bates practically tripped over his own boots as he scrambled for the iron keys. He unlocked the cell door, and Clara stumbled out. Her legs were so numb she nearly collapsed. But Caleb stepped forward, catching her with his free arm. He guided her to the wooden chair next to the potbelly stove, his eyes never leaving the two men. "I'm writing the receipt," Bates stammered, his hands shaking as he dipped a pen into the inkwell. 3,000. Paid in full by. "What's your name, mister?" "Caleb Wyatt." Blackwood watched with bitter, narrowed eyes. "You think you've won, Wyatt? You paid the debt on her father's estate, but the property taxes are due in a month. She has no income, and I own the bank. I'll find another way to take that land, and I'll find another way to put her back in that cell. A woman alone in this territory is easy prey." Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew Blackwood was right. The law in Oakhaven was a weapon wielded by the rich. A receipt wouldn't protect Clara from a corrupt judge or a fabricated charge next week. As a single woman, she had virtually no legal standing to fight Blackwood's endless resources. Caleb looked down at Clara. She was staring at the fire, shivering, rubbing her hands together. She had lost her father, her home was in jeopardy, and she had just spent the night facing the abyss. Caleb made a decision. It wasn't born of romance, but of cold, hard survival and a fierce, unyielding need to protect the woman who had saved his life. "Sheriff," Caleb said, lowering the rifle slightly, Where is the magistrate? Magistrate Hopkins? He lives over the Mercantile, 2 streets down. He's supposed to be here at 6. Go get him.
This story was
Caleb
posted on the
ordered.
channel The
In this
Rusty
storm?
Saddle. Please do not
You're
repost
crazy,
it in
Wyatt.
any form.
I ain't going out there. Caleb raised the Winchester again. Go get him. Tell him there's a wedding he needs to officiate. Clara's head snapped up. She stared at Caleb, her eyes wide with shock. Caleb? What are you talking about? Blackwood scoffed. A wedding? You think marrying her changes anything? It changes everything, Caleb said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. Under the Territorial Act, a married woman's debts, assets, and legal standing are protected under her husband. You can't touch her land without going through me. You can't file a suit against her without facing me. She won't be a ward of the county, and she won't be alone. He turned his gaze down to Clara. The fierce, terrifying demeanor softened for a fraction of a second. Clara, I owe you my life. I won't let this town tear you apart. If you take my name, my gold is yours, my land is yours, and no man in Colorado will ever put you in a cage again. Will you have me? Clara looked at the giant of a man standing before her. He was rough, wild, and smelled of wood smoke and ice. But in his eyes, she saw a profound, unshakable honor. He had ridden through a storm that killed men just to pull her from the dark. The wind howled outside, battering the stone walls. But inside the jailhouse, the air was perfectly still. Yes, Clara whispered, her voice finally steady. Yes, Caleb. I will. Caleb turned back to the sheriff. You heard her. Fetch the magistrate. Tell him he's got 30 minutes before dawn to make Clara Higgins a Wyatt, or I burn this jail to the ground. Sheriff Montgomery Bates did not want to go out into the blizzard, but the hollow, black eye of Caleb Wyatt's Winchester was a far more persuasive force than the howling wind. Swearing under his breath, Bates wrapped a woolen scarf over his face, yanked his hat down low, and shoved his way out through the splintered doorframe. The storm immediately swallowed him, leaving Caleb, Clara, and Josiah Blackwood in a tense, suffocating silence. Caleb propped a heavy wooden chair against the ruined doorway, using a stack of firewood and an anvil from the corner to barricade it against the gale. It kept the snow out, but the cold was already seeping back into the stone room. He walked back to the stove, stoking the dying embers and throwing in 3 fresh logs. Blackwood stood near the wall, his expensive boots tapping nervously against the floorboards. He looked from the pile of raw gold on the desk to the giant mountain man, his mind working frantically. You're making a mistake, Wyatt, Blackwood said, his voice dropping the false gentility. You're a rich man. I see the dust you brought. With that kind of capital, you and I could buy up half the timber rights in the valley. You don't need to saddle yourself with a ruined homesteader's daughter just to play the hero. Take your gold, walk away, and I'll ensure you have unrestricted trapping rights on every acre I own. Caleb didn't even look at him. He stood beside Clara's chair, his massive frame shielding her from the draft. I don't deal with men who build their fortunes on the backs of dying prospectors, Caleb rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. Keep your mouth shut, Blackwood, or I'll wire your jaw shut myself. Clara looked up at Caleb. Her shivering had subsided slightly, but the shock of the last hour was settling deep into her bones. She was a practical woman, raised on the unforgiving frontier. She knew that marriages in the territory were often matters of convenience, survival, or property. Romance was a luxury for city folk back east. But as she looked at Caleb's calloused hands and the rigid set of his jaw, she felt a strange, terrifying flutter in her chest. Caleb, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackling stove. You don't have to do this. You've already paid the debt. You've saved me. I can fight him in court. Caleb finally looked down at her. His icy blue eyes softened, just a fraction. Clara, you saw what he did to your father's ledgers. In Oakhaven, Blackwood is the court. Without a husband, the territorial laws consider you a spinster with no standing. He'll tie you up in injunctions until you starve or freeze in your own cabin. He knelt beside her, a mountain of a man bringing himself down to her eye level. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. From it, he extracted a simple, burnished silver ring. It was unadorned, heavy, and ancient. "My mother's," Caleb said softly. "Brought it across the plains in '58. I kept it safe up on the ridge. I ain't a man of soft words, Clara. I live a hard life in a hard place. But I swear on my life, if you wear this, no man will ever lay a hand on you, and no banker will ever steal what's yours. I will build a wall between you and the rest of this rotten world." Tears, hot and sudden, spilled over Clara's eyelashes, freezing on her pale cheeks. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against his rough knuckles. "I accept, Caleb. I am proud to take your name." The heavy thud of boots at the barricaded door interrupted them. Caleb stood up, his rifle instantly back in his hands. He kicked the anvil aside and pulled the chair back. Sheriff Bates stumbled in, looking like a snowman, dragging a furious, half-dressed Magistrate Thaddeus Hopkins by the arm. Hopkins was a skeletal man with a shock of white hair, wrapped in a heavy quilt over his nightshirt. He was shivering violently and clutching a leather-bound registry book to his chest. "This is an outrage," Hopkins sputtered, adjusting his spectacles. "Kidnapping a magistrate at gunpoint in the middle of a killer blizzard. I'll have you hanged for this, Wyatt. I know who you are, you mountain savage." Caleb stepped forward, towering over the frail judge. He reached out, grabbed the front of Hopkins's quilt, and lifted the man a few inches off the floor. "You'll hang nobody, Thaddeus," Caleb said quietly. "You're going to earn your county salary tonight. You've got 5 minutes to marry us, legally and bindingly, and stamp the deed transfer, or I'm throwing you back out into the snow without your boots." Hopkins swallowed hard, looking at the dead seriousness in Caleb's eyes, and then at the pile of gold on the desk. "Fine. Put me down." The ceremony was a stark, brutal affair, lit by the orange glow of the stove and accompanied by the shrieking wind. There was no music, no flowers, no family. There was only the cold iron of the jail cells, the furious glare of a defeated land baron, and the trembling voice of a magistrate rushing through the vows. "Do you, Caleb Wyatt, take this woman, Clara Higgins, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Hopkins read from his book, his teeth chattering. "I do," Caleb said, his voice echoing like thunder. "And do you, Clara Higgins, take this man?" "I do," Clara said, her voice steady now. Anchored by the weight of the silver ring Caleb slipped onto her finger. It was slightly too large, but it felt like the heaviest, most secure thing she had ever worn. "By the power vested in me, by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you man and wife," Hopkins stammered. "Sign the registry." Caleb signed with a bold, blocky script. Clara followed, her handwriting elegant despite her stiff fingers. Hopkins stamped the page with his official seal. Blackwood watched from the shadows, his face twisted into an ugly sneer. As Hopkins closed the book, Blackwood let out a slow, mocking clap. "Touching. Truly," Blackwood sneered, stepping forward. "You've saved her from the county prison wagon, Wyatt. Congratulations. But you're a fool if you think it ends here." Caleb turned, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "The debt is paid, Blackwood. The land is hers, which means it's mine. Step foot on it, and I'll bury you under it." Blackwood smiled, a thin, venomous line. "You paid Thomas Higgins's local debt, yes. But Thomas was desperate before he died. He didn't just borrow from me. To get the drilling equipment, he signed a secondary lien on the mineral rights." Clara's blood ran cold. "That's a lie. My father never mentioned a secondary lien." "He was ashamed, my dear," Blackwood said smoothly. "He signed the contract with the Colorado Silver and Trust Company out of Denver, specifically with Horace Gable. I merely act as their local broker. The contract states that if the primary debt defaults or is aggressively transferred without corporate approval, the trust can seize the acreage. "I just paid the debt," Caleb growled.
This story was posted on the
Locally,
channel The
Blackwood
Rusty
corrected,
Saddle. Please
"But
do
to
not
clear the
repost it in
corporate
any
lien,
form.
that stamped registry and the gold draft must be filed at the Central Claims Office in Denver before the end of the month. Today is the 28th. You have 3 days. The telegraph lines are down from the storm, and the passes are buried under 10 feet of snow. The trains won't run for a week." Blackwood's smile widened into a grin of pure malice. "You're trapped, Wyatt. By the time the snow melts, the deadline will have passed. Horace Gable will dispatch his Pinkertons to evict you, and not even a mountain man can shoot a dozen armed company men. The land will be mine anyway." Caleb stared at Blackwood, processing the information. The trap was indeed perfectly set. A lesser man would have broken right then and there. But Caleb merely picked up his saddlebags, now lighter by $3,000 of gold, and threw them over his shoulder. "Then we ride for Denver," Caleb said. Dawn did not bring the sun to Oakhaven. It only brought a marginally lighter shade of gray to the swirling white void. The blizzard showed no signs of breaking. The snow was piled up to the windowsills of the town's wooden storefronts, and the main street was an impassable ocean of drifts. Caleb shoved the ruined jailhouse door open, the wind immediately trying to push him back inside. He turned to Clara, wrapping his massive, fur-lined buffalo coat around her shoulders. It swallowed her whole, dragging on the floor, but the residual heat from his body trapped inside the thick hide offered an immediate, life-saving warmth. "Can you ride?" he asked, shouting over the gale. "I can ride," Clara shouted back, clutching the heavy lapels. "Samson is out back in the lean-to," Caleb said, handing her his thick leather gloves. "Put these on. We have to move fast. Blackwood isn't going to just let us walk out of town." Sheriff Bates and Magistrate Hopkins stayed huddled by the stove, refusing to even look toward the open door. Blackwood had already slipped out the back exit moments after delivering his ultimatum. Caleb knew the man too well. Cowards never fought their own battles. Caleb waded through the waist-deep snow to the side of the jailhouse, finding Samson stamping impatiently in the ramshackle lean-to. The massive draft horse snorted, a plume of steam rising from his nostrils. Caleb checked the cinches on the saddle, brushing a thick layer of ice off the leather. He lifted Clara effortlessly, setting her sideways in the saddle, and wrapped a thick wool blanket over her legs. "Hold on to the horn," Caleb instructed, taking Samson's reins and beginning to lead the horse out into the alleyway. "Keep your head down." They turned the corner onto Oakhaven's main thoroughfare. The wind was a physical barrier, stinging their eyes and freezing their breath. Visibility was less than 20 yards. Caleb trudged ahead, acting as a snowplow for the horse, his Winchester held in his right hand, angled downward to keep the snow out of the barrel. They had made it perhaps 50 yards, passing the dark windows of the general store, when Caleb stopped dead. Through the howling whiteout, 2 shadowy figures materialized in the center of the street, blocking their path out of town. Caleb recognized them instantly. Jebediah Rust, a former buffalo hunter with a reputation for shooting men in the back, and Cole Barrett, a wiry, vicious gun-for-hire, who had done Blackwood's dirty work for years. Both men had their dusters swept back, hands hovering near the heavy revolvers on their hips. "Hold it right there, Wyatt," Rust bellowed, his voice carrying on a gust of wind. He had a double-barreled shotgun resting lazily over his forearm. "Mister, Blackwood says there's been a misunderstanding at the jail. Says you robbed him of his gold and took the girl as a hostage." It was a blatant, transparent lie, constructed solely to give them a legal excuse to gun Caleb down in the street. With the sheriff bought and paid for, no one would ever dispute their version of events. "Move aside, Jebediah," Caleb yelled back, his voice cutting through the storm with lethal calm. "The debt is settled. I have no quarrel with you." "Can't do that, mountain man," Barrett sneered, taking a step to the side to flank Caleb. "There's a $500 bounty on your head. authorized by the mayor himself just 10 minutes ago. Drop the rifle and step away from the horse. Caleb didn't waste breath on another warning. He knew the arithmetic of survival. 2 men with drawn weapons at 20 paces in blinding snow. He had half a second. With blinding speed that defied his massive size, Caleb slapped Samson's flank, sending the horse surging forward into the snowdrift to his left, violently pulling Clara out of the direct line of fire. Simultaneously, Caleb dropped to one knee, the Winchester coming up to his shoulder in a single, fluid motion. Rust fired first. The boom of the shotgun was deafening, a flash of orange fire tearing through the white curtain. A spray of buckshot shredded the wooden awning post inches from Caleb's head, showering him in sharp splinters. Caleb squeezed the trigger. Crack. The heavy 44-40 bullet caught Jebediah Rust dead in the center of his chest. The force of the impact lifted the heavy man off his feet, throwing him backward into a snowdrift where he lay motionless, his shotgun clattering to the frozen mud. Cole Barrett cursed, drawing his revolver and fanning the hammer in a desperate panic. Bang! 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 Bullets whipped past Caleb, one tearing a hot groove through the thick fabric of his coat sleeve, grazing the flesh beneath. Caleb didn't flinch. He levered the Winchester, ejecting the smoking brass casing, and adjusted his aim through the swirling snow. Barrett turned to run, diving for the cover of a nearby water trough. Crack. Caleb's second shot caught Barrett in the right shoulder, spinning him like a top before he collapsed face first into the ice. Barrett screamed, dropping his gun and clutching his shattered collarbone, writhing in the snow. The entire gunfight had lasted less than 4 seconds. The silence that followed was immediate, swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. Caleb stood up slowly, keeping the rifle leveled at Barrett. He walked over to the wounded man, kicking the fallen revolver far out into the snow. Barrett looked up at him, his face pale with shock and agony. "Tell Blackwood," Caleb said, his voice as cold as the ice beneath his boots. "If he sends another man after me, I won't kill the man. I'll come back and burn his saloon to the ground with him in it." Caleb turned his back on Barrett and trudged over to where Samson was nervously pawing at the snow. Clara was pale, her eyes wide as she stared at the bodies in the street. She had seen violence before, but she had never seen a man move with such terrifying, calculated efficiency. "Are you hit?" Clara gasped, seeing the torn fabric on his sleeve. "It's a scratch," Caleb grunted, checking Samson for any stray pellets. Finding the horse unharmed, he took the reins again. "We need to go. Now." They didn't head for the main road leading out of the valley. It would be hopelessly buried and closely watched by Blackwood's remaining men. Instead, Caleb turned Samson toward the steep, treacherous switchbacks that led up into the Black Ridge Mountains. It was a suicide route in a blizzard, a narrow trail hugging vertical drop-offs, but it was the only way Caleb knew how to bypass the blocked valley passes and cut across the range toward Denver. For the next 10 hours, they endured a grueling, nightmarish ascent. The snow was unrelenting. Caleb broke trail the entire way, using his sheer physical strength to carve a path through drifts that sometimes towered over his head. Clara stayed slumped in the saddle, clinging to consciousness, her mind a blur of exhaustion and cold. She watched Caleb's broad back, moving with a mechanical, relentless rhythm. He was pushing his body past the limits of human endurance, driven by a stubborn, fierce devotion to the vow he had made in that freezing jail cell. By late afternoon, they finally breached the tree line. The air here was thin and razor-sharp, but miraculously, they had climbed above the worst of the storm system. The heavy clouds began to break apart, revealing slivers of pale, freezing blue sky, and the blinding glare of the afternoon sun reflecting off the endless expanse of white peaks. Caleb halted Samson. He leaned heavily against the horse's flank, his chest heaving, his beard completely solid with ice. He looked back at Clara. Her face was buried in the fur collar of his coat, but her dark eyes looked down at him. "We made it out of the valley," Caleb rasped, his breath pluming in the sunlight. There's a line shack 2 miles from here. We'll wait out the night there. Tomorrow, we cross the divide." Clara managed a weak, exhausted smile. She looked at the silver
This
ring on
story
her
was
finger,
posted on the channel
glinting
The
in
Rusty
pale
Saddle.
sunlight.
Please do not
She had lost
repost
her
it in any
father.
form.
Her home was in jeopardy, and she was hunted by ruthless men. But as she looked at the mountain man standing knee-deep in the snow, she realized she had never felt safer in her entire life. The line shack was nothing more than a crude 10 by 10 box of rough-hewn pine logs hammered into the side of a granite cliff, built years ago by prospectors who had long since gone bust or gone mad. It was half buried in a snowdrift when Caleb and Clara reached it just as the last bruised purple light bled out of the sky. Caleb practically carried Clara inside. She was dangerously lethargic, her core temperature plummeting after hours in the saddle despite the heavy buffalo coat. Inside, the air was stagnant and bitterly cold, but it was out of the wind. Caleb worked with brutal efficiency. He broke apart a rotted wooden chair and a section of the shelving, feeding the dry wood into a tiny iron stove in the corner. Within minutes, a small, smoky fire was casting desperate, dancing shadows against the log walls. He laid his heavy coat on the dirt floor near the stove and guided Clara onto it. "Sit close to the iron," he ordered softly, his voice raspy from breathing freezing air. "Don't touch it, but let the heat hit your chest." Only then did Caleb tend to himself. He stripped off his frozen leather gloves and unbuttoned his heavy canvas shirt. Clara watched through half-lidded, exhausted eyes as he bared his right arm. The bullet from Cole Barrett's revolver had gouged a deep, ugly trench through his bicep. The blood had frozen into a thick, black crust, sealing the wound during the ride. But in the warmth of the shack, the ice was melting, and sluggish crimson was beginning to seep down his muscular arm. Caleb gritted his teeth, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. He held the blade to the stove until the metal hissed, intending to cauterize the graze to prevent infection. "Stop," Clara croaked, her voice finding its strength. She forced herself to sit up, pushing the heavy coat aside. Caleb paused, looking back at her. "It needs to be burned, Clara. If it festers up here, I'll lose the arm. You'll pass out from the shock, and I can't lift you," she replied, a sudden, fierce pragmatism replacing her exhaustion. She remembered 2 years ago, boiling willow bark to save his leg. She was a homesteader's daughter. She knew blood and bone. "I have my father's flask in my dress pocket. There's whiskey in it, and there's clean linen in your saddlebags." Caleb hesitated, but the stern, unwavering look in her dark eyes stopped his argument. He handed her the knife. For the next hour, the only sounds in the shack were the crackle of the fire and the howling wind tearing at the roof. Clara worked with gentle, steady hands. She cleaned the wound with the biting whiskey. Caleb didn't so much as flinch, though the cords in his neck stood out like steel cables, and bound it tightly with strips of clean linen she tore from his spare shirt. When she finished, she slumped back against the log wall, her hands shaking from the adrenaline leaving her system. Caleb looked at the neat bandage, then at the woman sitting on the dirt floor. She was covered in soot. Her hair was a tangled mess, and she was shivering, yet she possessed a quiet, radiant strength that struck him harder than any bullet ever could. "You're a brave woman, Clara Wyatt," Caleb said quietly, using her new name for the first time. Clara looked down at the silver ring on her finger, the firelight catching its worn edges. "I didn't have much choice in the matter, did I?" "I'm sorry for the manner of it," Caleb said, his gaze dropping to the dirt floor. The mountain man, who had stared down a shotgun barrel without blinking, suddenly looked entirely out of his depth. "I forced a life on you today. I did it to keep Blackwood's hands off your throat, but I know this ain't a marriage born of affection. When we get to Denver and settle the deed, if you want to dissolve the registry, I won't stop you. You'll have your land free and clear." Clara looked at him, truly looked at him. She saw the exhaustion etched deep into the lines of his face, the physical toll of riding through a blizzard and taking a bullet just to buy her freedom. "Caleb," she said, her voice soft but absolute. She reached out, placing her small, warm hand over his massive, calloused one. You rode through the white death for me. You put yourself between me and men who would have killed us both. A piece of paper didn't save me today. You did. I wear this ring with pride. I won't be dissolving anything. A heavy, profound silence fell between them, heavier than the snow outside. Caleb looked into her eyes, seeing a reflection of the same fierce loyalty that had driven him down the mountain. He turned his hand over, his thick fingers gently interlacing with hers. He didn't have the words to express the sudden, overwhelming warmth blooming in his chest, so he simply held her hand, anchoring them both against the storm. At first light, they began the treacherous crossing of the Devil's Backbone. It was a narrow, terrifying ridgeline that straddled the continental divide. The wind up here was a physical entity, threatening to blow Samson straight off the 1,000-foot drop into the canyon below. Caleb walked ahead of the horse the entire way, testing the snow depth with a long pine branch, navigating purely by the jagged peaks that pierced the clouds. By noon of the second day, the punishing incline finally surrendered. They descended into the eastern valleys, where the snow was lighter and the timber thicker. By nightfall, they reached the smoky, bustling railhead at Clear Creek Station. They were battered, frostbitten, and exhausted, but they had beaten the mountain. Caleb traded 2 ounces of gold dust for a private compartment on the midnight locomotive bound for Denver. As the heavy iron wheels churned against the tracks, carrying them away from the wilderness and toward the epicenter of territorial power, Clara finally slept, her head resting securely against Caleb's good shoulder. Denver in 1878 was a city of brick, smoke, and ruthless ambition. It was a far cry from the snow-choked pines of Oakhaven. Here, fortunes were made on paper, and men were destroyed in boardrooms rather than in the street. The Colorado Silver and Trust Company occupied a grand, 3-story building constructed of imported red brick and polished brass. When Caleb and Clara walked through the heavy glass doors on the final afternoon of their deadline, the busy clerks and well-dressed investors stopped and stared. Caleb looked like a creature dragged from the Pleistocene epoch. He still wore his heavy, blood-stained buffalo coat. His beard was wild, his boots were caked in freezing mud, and the Winchester rifle was slung unabashedly over his shoulder. Clara walked beside him, wrapped in a woolen shawl she had bought at the station. Her chin held high, her eyes scanning the opulent room with a sharp, calculating intelligence. "Can I help you?" a terrified clerk asked from behind a brass-caged teller window. "We're here to see Horace Gable," Caleb rumbled. "Tell him Caleb and Clara Wyatt are here to settle the Higgins lien." 10 minutes later, they were ushered into a sprawling corner office overlooking the muddy, bustling streets. Horace Gable sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a man of fastidious grooming, with slicked-back dark hair, a tailored pinstripe suit, and a pocket watch chain made of pure silver. He looked at Caleb with a mixture of amusement and profound distaste. "Mr. and Mrs. Wyatt," Gable said smoothly, steepling his fingers. "I must admit, your arrival is a surprise. I received a telegram from my associate, Josiah Blackwood, just this morning. The telegraph lines have been restored, it seems. He informed me that Thomas Higgins's daughter had defaulted, that the property was forfeit, and that a local ruffian had robbed him of the settlement money at gunpoint." Caleb's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Clara stepped forward, dropping the heavy canvas sack of gold onto Gable's pristine desk with a loud "THUD." "Josiah Blackwood is a liar and a thief, Mr. Gable," Clara said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative in the quiet office. "He fabricated supply debts to force my father into default. He attempted to extort me into a labor contract. My husband paid the $3,000 debt in Oakhaven in front of a territorial magistrate. We have the stamped registry right here." She pulled the folded, official document from her satchel and slid it across the mahogany. Gable barely glanced at it. "Be that as it may, Mrs. Wyatt, the primary debt in Oakhaven is irrelevant to me. My company holds a secondary lien on the mineral rights. The contract clearly states that if the property falls into dispute, Or if the primary debt is transferred without my direct approval, the lien defaults to the Colorado Silver and Trust. Blackwood has initiated a dispute. Therefore, the land is mine." Gable leaned back, a smug, patronizing smile on his lips. "You can take your gold back to the mountains, Mr. Wyatt. You cannot fight a corporate contract with a rifle." Caleb took a slow, heavy step toward the desk. The sheer, imposing menace radiating from him caused Gable's smile to falter. "Look at the registry, Gable," Caleb growled. Gable frowned, picking up the paper. He read the magistrate's messy scrawl. "I don't see how a marriage certificate changes corporate law," Gable sneered. "It changes the ownership," Clara interjected, stepping beside Caleb. "Under the Territorial Act of 1861,
This story was posted on the channel The Rusty Saddle. Please do not repost it
all
in any
outstanding
form.
debts, liens, and assets of a single woman are immediately absorbed and legally restructured under the husband's estate, nullifying prior localized default clauses unless the husband himself is insolvent. Caleb Wyatt is not insolvent." Gable's eyes narrowed. He looked at the girl, realizing she was far more educated in territorial law than Blackwood had suggested. "Furthermore," Clara continued, pressing her advantage, "Blackwood didn't want that land for the timber, Mr. Gable. He wanted it because my father found a secondary vein of tellurium beneath the quartz ridge before he died. Tellurium implies deep vein gold. Blackwood knew it, and he hid it from you. He was going to seize the land, wait for your secondary lien to expire or buy it out for pennies, and keep the strike for himself. He was stealing from his own company." Gable sat up straight, his businessman's composure cracking. "Tellurium? Are you certain? I assayed the rock myself." Clara lied smoothly, though she suspected it was true based on her father's secret excitement before his illness. "Blackwood played you for a fool, Gable. He used your company's money to trap my father, intending to cut you out of the real profit." Gable looked at the canvas sack of gold, then at the stamped marriage registry, and finally at the giant mountain man who looked perfectly capable of throwing him out the third-story window. Capitalists were many things, but above all, they were pragmatic. The revelation of Blackwood's betrayal shifted the arithmetic entirely. "3,000 covers the Oakhaven debt," Gable said slowly, his mind racing. "The corporate lien requires a settlement of $2,000 to clear the title completely." Caleb reached into his coat and produced a second, slightly smaller sack of gold. He dropped it next to the first. "There's 2,500 in there," Caleb said. "Weigh it, then sign the deed over to my wife." Gable stared at the gold. A guaranteed, immediate profit in raw dust, plus the opportunity to severely punish Josiah Blackwood for attempting to defraud the trust. It was a good day for business. Gable pulled a heavy ledger from his drawer, dipped his fountain pen in ink, and began to write. "I will have the official deed drawn up and notarized within the hour, Mrs. Wyatt. The lien is dissolved. The property is yours, free and clear." He looked up at Caleb. "And I will be sending a team of Pinkertons to Oakhaven tomorrow to audit Mr. Blackwood's operations. I suspect he will be removed from his position." Caleb didn't smile, but the tension in his massive shoulders finally unwound. "Make sure they go heavily armed," Caleb advised coldly. "He's a snake when cornered." An hour later, Caleb and Clara walked out of the Colorado Silver and Trust Company, the official, stamped deed tucked safely into Clara's satchel. The late afternoon Denver sun was breaking through the city smog, casting a warm, golden light over the muddy streets. They stood on the wooden boardwalk, the noise of the city washing over them. Clara looked down at the satchel, then up at the giant of a man who had changed her world in a matter of days. "It's over," she whispered, the reality of it finally washing over her. "We won." Caleb looked at her, the corners of his mouth twitching upward beneath his thick beard in a rare, genuine smile. "No, Clara, we survived. Now, we go home." The blizzard of 1000, 878 became a legend in the territory. But the true legend belonged to the mountain man who rode through the White Death to buy a bride and break a tyrant. Caleb and Clara Wyatt returned to Oakhaven not as victims, but as an undeniable force. Josiah Blackwood, ruined by the corporate audit and terrified of Caleb's wrath, fled the territory in the dead of night, leaving his empire to crumble. They became a testament to the raw, untamed spirit of the frontier, a partnership anchored by a silver ring, a Winchester rifle, and a love that burned fiercely enough to melt the darkest winter.